Hello, my name is Ripley Atkinson. I'm the Australian Livestock and Commodities Manager for StoneX based in Sydney. This week, the Australian Bureau of Statistics released their Q2 slaughter and production numbers for the Australian livestock sector. And within that, we got to have a really good look at what was happening with obviously slaughter volumes and production numbers as well. And that'll also support and inform the figures. Really underpins what we've seen in the export space in terms of the volume we're exporting. These figures further validate that. Now, admittedly, the figures are 7 to 8 weeks delayed on when Q2 of the calendar year ended. Nonetheless, they are actual numbers, not voluntary reported figures. So they've been a really valuable piece of information to get our hands on this week. And it gives the market a bit further clarity on where the cattle cycle's at. Within those figures, though, I have picked 3 key takeaways from those results, namely, obviously, the decade high results at a quarterly level for slaughter volumes. Secondly, that record production is something that's really important at the minute, and it's something we'll touch on a little later. And finally, the importance of not taking too much notice of the fact that despite female quarterly kill volumes are at their second highest level on a quarterly basis since 1978, that shouldn't be construed or recognised or seen as the national cattle herd's in liquidation, because what's happening on the ground is different to what the numbers indicate, and there's a little bit of nuance that needs to be applied to that result. I'll start certainly with the slaughter volumes though. So for Q2, slaughter hit 2.34 million head. That was the highest quarterly volume we've had of any quarter since Q2 2015. When you look at those numbers, that 2.34 million at a seasonal level, they're up 10% year on year or compared to Q2 24, which equated to about an increase of 215,000 head. Now, when you look at the sort of year-to-date, if you will, figures, so the first half of 2025, January to June, national slaughter volumes were up by 13% or 580,000 head. That's compared to the first half of last year, so to the 30th of June 24. What that tells us and what it really reaffirms are 2 things. The first is the growing volume of slaughter cattle, or the growing availability of slaughter cattle at the minute, which is a reflection of the growing herd hitting multi-decade highs by the end of this year. And secondly, which is quite important, is the growing capacity or the rising capacity of processors to deal with this increased supply. That's something that I think is quite critical at the minute to recognise, is when you can see slaughter numbers are increasing by, nearly 600,000 head compared to the first 6 months of last year, it tells you the processors are handling those high supplies by getting through them. And I think that's something we need to recognise. It also, talks to that improvement generally in just the capacity aspect. Either processors are taking on more shifts, their labour workforce is becoming more productive, expansion works are finished. There's a number of different aspects, to that situation. Obviously, in the past 12 months, we've had a plant in South Australia come online completely, following it being shut down for a period of sort of 7 years after fire. That aspect, is another example of the increase in capacity within the national beef kill, which is really contributing to this increase in throughput we're seeing. Moving beyond that, though, I think it's worthwhile, while we're talking slaughter, before looking at production and carcass weights, the female kill numbers for Q2 of this year hit 1.275 million head. That was the second highest quarter Australia has had for female kill since 1978. So it surpassed the liquidation volumes that we've seen, or that we saw during the 18-19 drought. Admittedly, that was a real low point for the industry in terms of the amount of females that were getting processed, simply because, nationally the country was in drought. What I think is I'd like to sort of just elaborate on a little bit today is the fact that particularly the key cattle regions of the country. And when I say that, I mean regions north of a line at Dubbo or Sydney throughout, across Australia. Those regions where the majority of the cattle are north of Dubbo in New South Wales. They're experiencing arguably one of their best seasons on record, right across, Queensland, northern New South Wales, the Territory or the Northern Territory, and sort of far east Western Australia, where the bulk of Australia's cattle herd are in fantastic seasonal conditions. They're not liquidating numbers. Now, there's no question that there is liquidation continuing, and there has been liquidation for sort of 18 months to 2 years in Southern Australia, but we know that the northern regions aren't liquidating. Now, we shouldn't be surprised that we are seeing, kill numbers generally, but even female kill numbers reach the levels they are. And there's a few things because of that. The cow price recently, or up until recently, it's come off its highs in the past week to 10 days. But generally, so far this year, cow prices producers are receiving have been very, very strong. And what that's allowed the producer to do is sell those cows into a very strong market, generate a positive return on those cows, and take that money. Furthermore to that, we've got these younger, more productive heifer crops coming through, which are larger, that can replace those cows which have been sold. And the genetic performance and the genetics within those heifers are better performers, and they will be in the long run, than the cows getting turned off because of the genetic improvement and investment producers have made in their herds. There's that aspect. There's also the fact that naturally, with a cattle herd at multi-decade highs, we shouldn't be surprised that we're killing more cattle. It's just the way, you would expect things to be. And I think we've got to remember that, because we're not in this widespread, national liquidation. The other aspect to it, is the fact that processors and exporters specifically that are operating processing facilities, have been really encouraged to buy a lot of females and buy cows particularly to go into the grinding market to then export into America because of the positivity in that trade. That's been a big driver of it as well. And the processors and exporters are prioritizing, or have been prioritizing, space in their kill chains on a weekly basis or on a shift for cows and product to go into grinding meat, which is traditionally your cows. So that aspect as well needs to be added into this situation. And I don't think, from my personal view, we should recognize that as a sign that the national herd is liquidating. It's quite a regional specific dynamic. And the fact of the matter is the majority of Australia's cattle in those regions I mentioned earlier are experiencing a great season. And if anything, their cattle herd and their numbers are going to grow this year by November 2025. And I think that's something to be mindful of. Moving past that though, while I talk on carcass weights quickly, they did decline quarter on quarter by 5 kilos. I mentioned, the influence of females just a moment ago, and that will have contributed. Also the fact that, the South has been in drought in Australia, and you do see that during drought times when there's a lack of pasture available, carcass weights do soften. So quarter on quarter they were down, but when you compare them seasonally to Q2 24, they were about the same. They were 307 kilos ahead. So there's some consistency there. But ultimately, those carcass weights, when you look at some longer term performance, which is, adding to the fact of this dynamic about production, they were in line for Q2 with 5-year averages, and they were above 10-year averages. So now we understand that slaughter and carcass weights are performing very well. That's delivering us record beef production. So in Q2 of this year, beef production hit a record of any quarter at 718,000 metric tons. And when you look at the seasonal aspect of 25 so far, so Jan to June figures, beef production this year is operating 15% or 179,000 metric tons in front of year to date or half year 24 numbers. It gives you an idea of how strong the performance is at the minute, and those really strong production volumes are playing into what we're seeing in exports, which has been, continually on a monthly level anyway, continually record-breaking export levels. That's all we've got time for this week. But in the next episode, We're going to dive into the recently released MLA and Alpha lot feeding brief for the Q2 results, which should be something really interesting to have a look at, particularly with some strong expectations for growth in the feedlot sector, capacity, utilisation and turn-off. But for more content like this, head over to Apple or Spotify and subscribe to the Australian Cattle and Beef Market Report, your fortnightly podcast where I discuss everything related to production, supply, price, demand, exports for the Australian beef industry and what that means and the factors associated to that and how it's affecting the market at the minute. There will be a link to that podcast in the show notes. But until we chat next time, take care. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you then. Cheers.